All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Cam McIntyre. I'm Secretary Treasurer for the school district. We're going to start off. I'm going to introduce our board chair, Kate Toy. She's going to give an initial greeting to welcome you to the meeting and to acknowledge our territory.
Hi, thank you so much, Cam. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. And I would love to acknowledge that we are gathered tonight on the unceded, unsurrendered traditional territory of the Coast-Tsimshian Smalyak speaking people. And as an uninvited guest on these territories, I do take serious responsibility in my commitment to educating myself on the relationship to the land, the culture, and the language of the Coast-Tsimshian people. I would also like to take a moment tonight to explain the decision of the board to meet on Zoom. We had conversations about what would be the best way to do our first round of consultations. And we knew that we had a great turnout during COVID for the budget when we didn't have a choice and we had to meet virtually, and we explored hybrid models and we really didn't know how that was going to best serve, and we didn't know how that could having a hybrid model. And so for this first round, we decided to go with virtual in the hope that we would get people who might not be able to attend due to childcare, transportation, family commitments. And so we're hoping to see a great turnout tonight. And then I also just really want to thank staff for setting this all up so that we're able to meet virtually, and also to every single one of you that made time to come tonight to make sure that your voice is heard and that are committed to our children and our community. So thank you so much. I will pass this back to you, Cam. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, sorry. So just to review the agenda, what we're going to go through, we're going to start with the strategic plan. In order to have a successful budget process, that budget needs to be supporting the direction of the board and the direction of the district, which is outlined in the strategic plan. Andrew Samuel, the superintendent, will speak to that section. Then we'll have a reasonably short review looking through enrollment and funding and our expectations for the rest of this year and the multi-year focus going into the future, which we're required to be looking at a sort of multi-year broad plan in conjunction with the annual budget. Talk a bit about the surplus and reserve funds, and then we'll head into the consultation. So at this point, I will turn it over to Mr. Samuel to begin our discussion around the strategic plan.
Thanks, Cam. Hope everyone can hear me. My name is Andrew Samuel. I'm the superintendent of schools. And one of the things that I have worked with the board on is the creation of a strategic plan. And this has been done with consultation with our partners, with our rights holders, our stakeholders, and certainly our staff. And this replaces our previous strategic plan. And we think this plan more accurately reflects where we're going in the district and with the resources that we have. Just going to advance, or Cam, you'll advance me to the next slide, please. We started with a vision statement, and the vision statement is, they're difficult to write because they must be meaningful. And with the vision and the mission statement, what we're doing is, this is the front matter. This is the foundational document that when we need to make decisions, we frequently go back to our vision and we say, so how is the decision we're making going to help us create, critical thinkers with a strong sense of identity on Tsimshian territory? Next slide, please, Cam. Now, we also have what we value. And of course, there was a lot of discussion on these with all of our staff. It's very difficult to pick exactly the word you want, but we've defined each of these as well to help understand our value system. And again, this is what's helping us to make our decisions for all of our learners. And it's also how we work with our staff and our community. So this is a graphic that represents that, and all of this material is available on our website. And if you can go to the next slide, Cam. Our belief statements are, we obviously believe that our biggest strength is found in our diversity. We talk to people who have worked here and lived here for many years in the community. We talk to them about what they saw as important. We talk to people whose children had graduated from our system, and many of them provided feedback. And that's largely how we came about with what we believe. And again, this is on our website, but again, it's a foundational document that guides our decision-making. Next slide, please. This graphic, we think, embodies sort of the water and the timber and the place that we are situated on traditional Tsimshian territory. We know that all of our staff take it seriously to identify reconciliation topics and to work with 65% of our learners are Indigenous. And so this graphic kind of helps us to look at that, to say, we have Indigenous ways of knowing. The Indigenous Ed Department is wonderful at helping disseminate this information. We have a culture of care because this is a journey. We're developing our relationship with our Indigenous rights holders. And also, we're working together to ensure that our system and the decisions that we're making are future focused. So it's not just what are we doing this month and next month, but what are we doing 2 years and 3 years from now? And you'll see in the financial statements that we review here that even the ministry is asking us to look at a 3-year plan. So we try and balance the immediate needs of 1 year, but also the ministry is saying, but you should also look at the up to 3 years from now to see where you're going. Next slide, please. So in meetings we've had with our partners, et cetera, we believe that our priorities are, of course, literacy and numeracy. We have literacy rates that are showing improvement, and to that end, we have a literacy helping teacher. We do not currently have a numeracy helping teacher, but this is the consultation we're doing with you tonight. Our equity action plan, as Cam McIntyre will show you later, there's a number of special purpose grants that provide us with additional funding that as many of you have heard me say frequently, so they're giving us additional money to have somebody work on equity issues with us. You can't take that money and buy a new van for the maintenance department with it. These are restricted funds, and Cam will go into greater detail on this, but our equity action plan is, we recognize that the need for all of our staff and the community at large to understand truth and reconciliation. And we've started a series of in-services with all staff. And as I say, from the bus driver to the EAs, to teachers, to helping teachers, principals, superintendent, and soon to be trustees, everyone attends two half-day sessions with Lori Berger and the Indigenous education staff, and with elders also attending. And we talk about truth and we talk about reconciliation. And it's meant to keep this in the forefront of what are we doing, why are we here, who are we working with? And this is a very important block of our priorities. Mental health literacy, and I believe we have another slide on this. We know that some of our students need help in coping. The world is changing, it's changing rapidly. Prince Rupert is a changing place. Growth is in some places phenomenal. And we know that there are some of our students who require additional supports. So we were able to increase counseling time at the high school level, and that allows a teacher to not just do one-to-one, but small group and whole classroom mental health literacy presentations and work. And we had an example of that at the last board meeting. And lastly, our commitment to truth and reconciliation, which is, I am currently taking the University of British Columbia course on reconciliation through Indigenous education, because my belief is I need to learn more about this, and I encourage all of our staff as well to continue their growth. So the effects of the pandemic, we debated whether we should put this slide in, but I think it's important to know that when I meet with staff, we're learning about the unintended consequences. And there are unintended consequences that were not foreseen by the experts, and that is attendance is recovering, albeit slowly in some locations. And we're tracking attendance and on a daily basis. We also know that the caseloads for speech and hearing have gone up. There's a great deal of leftover things from COVID, and it does affect children. We know that mask wearing has some effect. And so we're starting to see that come through in our students. And so we're addressing these as best we can. And lastly, food security. We are fortunate this year that the ministry has recognized that we have families who are not fully employed. And so the ministry has provided us with what was to be 1 year funding, but now it'll be 2 years. A grant that allows us to help families with food and the high cost of things in our grocery stores. And if you go into our grocery stores, you will see that the price of a lot of items has gone way up in the past 12 months, 18 months. So we're working on that issue as well. Every school has a budget, and we'll talk more about that. Next slide, please.
And that's coming back to me.
Cam will take over on enrollment.
All right. So for the most part, I'm going to be discussing the operating budget, which is what the board has to approve. But within the bigger context, there's also capital funds and special purpose funds. I will comment on those a little bit later as we go along. And when I looked at enrollment, I wanted to go back pre-pandemic on this particular slide. So you will see in 1920, we had quite a number more students than we had the following year when the pandemic hit for the first time. And our budget projections were not met for a couple of years in a row. And that sometimes actually challenged us in terms of there were some implications on funding that the board had to address when we got to the amended budget. So for the current year, we reduced our estimate quite a bit to 1775. We actually did end up almost flat compared to the prior year at 1817. I will demonstrate what that means in terms of how the funding model works in a little bit. And going into next year, we're again going to keep our projection fairly low and just kind of see where funding goes, because, enrollment ultimately, determines what our funding is for the most part for the operating budget. So when we look at the operating grant and how that's produced, if you take the operating grant we have for the current year, the ministry has pages and pages of calculations for different parcels of money they all consider in going into the total operating grant. One of those is called funding protection. At the end result, you'll get the funding for next year. Now, the way the funding model works is they guarantee that we will not have less than 98.5% of the prior year. That's basically the funding protection calculation. But what that means is, as long as we're in funding protection, we're actually seeing a decrease in operating revenue of about $370,000 each year. And this is what actually happened. That estimate we had of 1775 students and our actual number of 1818 students, you'll see there was this year, in fact, no impact on the funding, although there was more students, but the calculation of funding protection fell to leave us at that number that was basically 98.5% of the previous year. And so, that's the forecast going forward, is we can continue to expect, so long as we're in this funding model and with this funding protection, that the operating revenue available to the board will be declining. How could that change? Well, the funding model review, the ministry had implemented part of those recommendations. They did not yet implement the remaining recommendations. We don't know for certain what that would mean if they implement the rest of those recommendations. I don't think the board situation would be any worse than losing 1.5% every year, but there's always a hope that it could in fact be better. The other thing would be if our enrollment began to increase finally, and we've been expecting with the growth of the port facilities and all the rest that enrollment should start to increase, but that has not yet been the case. The other aspect is funding collective agreements. So we've gone through the process of estimating the collective agreement this year is, between sort of 3% and 4% increase, as various calculations of how that's determined. And the total cost increase to the district, we're forecasting at $880,000. We have not yet received specific announcements from the ministry as to the funding that we will receive. The general comment is the government will fund the collective agreements, and this year, for the first time in many years, we've also been advised that they'll fund exempt pay increases. In terms of the amended budget, we're simply going to have to assume that that's the amount we receive, and we'll be continuing to watch for the actual announcements as they come. And what the ministry does when they say they're funding the collective agreement is they keep that separate from that whole funding protection calculation, because they recognize this is a real additional cost over and above our normal operations. So for the current year and the amended annual budget, the board will be looking at in a couple of weeks. What we've seen in terms of revenue is that when the ministry gave us the initial calculation, part of it is an assumption as to how much is the board receives through what are called local education agreements with Metlakatla and Hartley Bay. And the government had overestimated how much that was, which means we'll actually be getting a little bit more revenue from the ministry as we go forward. In addition, we've received quite a few more approvals through Jordan's Principle, which is a fund that specifically supports Indigenous students. You'll see that most of that is reflected a couple lines down in additional EA salaries. Teacher salaries, we've noted, are higher than budget. And really the primary reason that we've noted for that is that we have had a significant increase in the number of teachers who've been away on short-term medical leaves and some of them going on to long-term. And when that happens, while we're paying the first teacher sick days, we're paying a second teacher to cover the class. The TTOC budget, the substitute budget, is really for kind of 1 and 2 day and shorter absences. And if it goes over 20 days, then we hire another teacher. So we've just seen a significant increase in that this year. Principal and vice principal salaries has gone the other direction for us this year. You'll be aware that we have 1 principal and 3 vice principals who are new in their position, and they're at a lower pay on their grid than the people who used to be in those jobs. So in the end, we saved a little bit of money there. As I've noted, EA salaries are higher, and that's primarily a number of additional EAs hired through Jordan's Principle. Benefit costs are higher. That's partly the net effect of higher salaries, and it's partly just sort of how much we're paying in benefits. Historically, we typically go between 22 and 23% of salaries in terms of benefit costs, and the budget was around 22, and we're noticing we're getting closer to 23. That's in part due to things like the Canada Pension Plan and employment insurance and WorkSafe premiums have all increased, and those aren't numbers that we know at the time that the budget's being set, but they've gone up this year. So services and supplies, we're going to be forecasting that we'll need to make some reductions in there. There'll be more details at the next board meeting in terms of how we'll ensure that the current year finishes on budget. And so, this is the overall picture that we're currently forecasting being short about $200,000, taking all those things into account. And so that's something the board will be addressing at their next board meeting with the amended budget. Now, we are supposed to look at multi-year focus. Going out 3 years. And so as I look towards next year, so my forecast is that we'll be losing $370,000 from ministry revenue, but we will be funded for collective agreements. And next year, that's a 5.5% increase. So we'll know that we'll need to make reductions in the current budget as well. The board has been working to have an appropriate level of surplus that's available for contingencies. That's something else the board will need to look at. But overall, I'm going to focus back again to the conversation we started with on the strategic plan. Whatever decisions the board is going to need to make is to focus on those priority areas, literacy and equity and truth and reconciliation and all those things to make sure that we're doing the best we can so that the students are successful. So this is the longer term picture. I'm going to focus just on the first year, 23-24 column in there. So on the revenue side, it's a reduction of $370,000 plus an addition for the 5.5%. Salaries is up by the 5.5%. On the supplies and service line, you'll see in 22-23, we had $318,000 that was coming out of reserve, out of surplus. That was one-time spending that has been approved for the current year. So that 318 primarily comes out of services and supplies. And for the purpose of this first look, I've assumed that what's left in services and supplies would be subject to the same 5.5% inflation increase. That may or may not be the amount that we end up set. From my perspective, that's likely kind of the worst case scenario that I'm expecting for the budget for next year. I've assumed there's still 100,000 will be needed to increase the board's surplus contingency, as well as the ongoing contribution towards vehicles. So that puts us, I'm hoping, a worst case scenario of a potential decrease of $735,000. Now, when you look at the subsequent years and you see very big numbers, once the board makes its decisions to balance the 23-24 budget, that reduces the amount you need to subtract in the subsequent years. So you would take that 700,000 off of the 1.1 million and off of the 1.6 million as you go along. The board's not being asked to make those decisions for the future, but it's just important to recognize, so long as we continue in funding protection, that revenue will be going down and there will be some inflation pressure on costs. And so it's a longer term process that we're still in. So then I want to talk a little about capital funds, and I'll just, as I get here, I don't have a slide specifically on special purpose funds, but special purpose funds are money that has to be spent on one particular thing. So some of the biggest examples is we have one that's called the annual facilities grant that has to be spent on effectively maintenance of buildings and property. We have the classroom enhancement fund, and that's really the money that's been coming from the government when the language was restored to the teacher collective agreement, and it's primarily used to hire more teachers, and it's only used for that purpose. We have special purpose funds for Strong Start and Community Link, which is an additional fund that helps meet needs of vulnerable students. Those basically have money that go in and out, and there's very little overlap between those and the operating budget. Capital funds, on the other hand, there is some overlap with the operating budget. So what happens in the capital fund, the money we get from the ministry generally funds schools and buses. And any other capital needs the district may have doesn't generally come from the ministry. So if we need a significant software or hardware equipment update for an IT, replacement of all of our maintenance vehicles, that's that 45,000 a year the board's been setting aside. Contributions to playgrounds is something we've often done. I think one of the things I'll be recommending going forward is, historically, we used to get a grant from the ministry and the district would kick in 10% to help to ensure with the costs of installing it properly and all the rest. These days, the PACs have been very successful in getting significant additional grants, and I'm not sure that the board needs to continue to contribute 10% towards those projects, given how generous other community sponsors have been. Any upgrade or change to district building and fixtures, that would also come from another source than ministry capital. And leasehold improvements, I'll just mention, so the Pacific Coast School, which is in a leased location, the board paid for those improvements when we moved into that spot. If the board ever had to consider moving into another spot, there would need to be a source of funds to do improvements to the new location if they were to move there. So when I look at the surplus that the board had set aside at the end of last audit, at the end of the June year end, there was money set aside really for capital purposes. That's that first line, part of it for vehicles and part of it towards some IT replacement, particularly the board's software that manages all human resources and payroll and accounts payable will need to get replaced in the fairly near future. Then there's sort of two school categories. The school generated funds is money that was actually raised by the school, and that's in the school's bank account, and it generally stays there. The school carryover funds are funds from last year's operating budget that were not completely spent, and we reserve that so the schools can use it the following year. In Indigenous education, so the targeted funding comes from the ministry and can only be used for Indigenous education. The underlying Indigenous is money that's being accumulated over time, primarily through the Language Authority, and we're looking at a process, in fact, to move that kind of out of reserves and back over to a special purpose fund. Planned projects, that's part of that 318,000 I mentioned for the current year. That's related to the middle school and related to some IT work that's underway. And then there was a pool of training money. Now the 3-year, 1-year numbers beside that are generally the period of time over which we're expecting those funds might be used. So we think that that vehicle and IT money generally we think would be spent over the next 3 years, whereas the school carryover funds and the targeted Indigenous funds and the planned projects, we're expecting all that money to be used this year. At the bottom, you'll see that at the end of June, the board had about $200,000 set aside in its unrestricted surplus for contingency. The board's policy would suggest that number should be closer to $500,000. So that's where we were in terms of financial data and where we're sitting currently. We're going to describe the various ways the board will be receiving consultation from the public. I'm going to start first with this criteria. I've sometimes gone over this fairly quickly, but there are 2 new trustees, so I'm going to spend a little bit longer just explaining these this year. So any budget decision, the very first thing on the list is what is the impact on student learning? And how does that align with the strategic plan? Those go pretty much hand in hand. So that's at the very top of the criteria of the board's decision-making process. Then when you look at any specific suggestions, is it a one-time cost or is it a longer-term ongoing cost? So for example, you're going to buy a piece of equipment or you're going to hire a person that you would expect to continue into future years. Then the focus of being narrow or broad is this: if it's a broad focus, it will impact students across the district. If it's a narrow focus, that may be looking at one subset of students in what it would be supporting. The amount of savings or investment is simply that, the dollar amount. Is this a large request or a small request? Is there an ability to attract outside funding or partnerships? And, the playgrounds is a good example of that. The ministry gives us an initial chunk of money, and then we get a lot of partners who come in and supply more money. On the operating budget, we sometimes have those opportunities as well. And then the board, of course, could discuss and had additional criteria. So the consultation will be kind of 4 parts to this. The Survey Monkey is live today up on the website. I'll talk about that in a moment. There's a proposal form to make specific requests. Today we'll be doing the Talking Circle consultation, and then we'll have partner group presentations coming up. This is the link. We'll post that link up on the website, hopefully tomorrow. Allows anybody who wants to specifically give your suggestions to trustees with respect to the budget. We'll keep that survey open until the end of February. This is the proposal form. You can't read that, but the actual form is available on the website. And it just says, if you have something specific you would like the board to consider, you can provide a lot more detail about why this is a proposal the board should be considering. And it can be for spending. It can also be for savings that you might identify. The deadline for that form is February 24th, and gives us more time to analyze any submissions that come in. You can submit it through your principal straight to the board office, and also go through your union, or the DPAC could send one in, or the Indigenous Education Council can submit them as well. Now, normally I do next steps after the consultation, but I kind of realize we'll be in 4 different rooms, and really when the discussions finish in the rooms, we're just going to say you can leave the meeting at that point. We won't be coming back together at the very end, so you won't have some rooms waiting for other rooms to finish their discussion. So I'm going to go through the next steps now, and then we'll get ready to go into our rooms. So the next ABC meeting is February 16th. That is specifically where the traditional partner groups can make us presentation to the trustee. That will be a public meeting. It will be held in person at the booth meeting room, but will also be streamed online for those who aren't able to attend in person. And those time slots will begin at 7. The next public meeting will be on April the 11th. At that point, we'll be giving you feedback. We'll be advising you kind of a summary of everything that the board has heard. We'll be trying to identify any options the board's likely to be considering when they get to the budget approval meeting. So if there's any cuts that are potentially on the board, other new spending initiatives that are being proposed, and there'll be kind of an open mic opportunity to address trustees as well as part of that meeting. The actual meeting to approve the budget is scheduled for April the 20th. That's a Thursday. It'll be kind of a special purpose meeting. That'll be the only item on the agenda for the board that night. And again, that will be live in the booth meeting room as well as an online Zoom link. So again, any ideas, just let anybody know, any principal, manager, let Andrew or I know directly. Our email addresses will be here, and this presentation will be up on the website as well, so you can come back and look at it. And now we're going to move into the Talking Circle. So we've set up breakout rooms already. We are trying to have a mix of participants in each group. So there'll be teachers, trustees, parents, staff in various ways. Each group will have a facilitator and a note taker. The summary of the notes taken will go up on the website and be provided to trustees as well. Trustees really are here primarily to hear from you. They'll be sort of in the rooms. They can participate in the discussion. Primarily, I expect we'll be sort of seeking further clarification of items that people have said. And the moderators will kind of manage that process as we go through. We request if you have a camera that you turn that on when you're in your talking circle. If you don't have the camera, at least let people know your name and your relationship to the district as the meeting gets underway in your circle. Facilities will be asking each person for their comments because everybody sees the faces in a different order on their screens. The facility will kind of go through the order they should have on their screen and ask for those comments. When you're asked, you can then unmute and make your comments. We'd ask you to mute again when it's then somebody else's turn. After everybody's had an opportunity to speak to the question, the facility would also recognize people who raise a hand who would have additional comments based on what they've heard so far in the circle. And these are the questions. We're actually using the same questions as last year, but first of all, what is most important? What must we do as a district to ensure we have success? We want to hear what's actually making a difference and what's working well in our schools. And we get to the tough question of how do we allocate our limited resources? What changes do we make to ensure that we are allowing every student to succeed? So that's my part. I'm going to say sort of thank you there. I'm going to ask Tammy, and by the way, thank you to Tammy Dickens, who's been doing all the work in the background, creating all these rooms for us and letting everybody in the meeting while we've been busy talking. You should get an invite now to be able to go to your discussion rooms. Andrew and I will be floating between the rooms a little bit, so you'll see us pop in and out.